It is 1991 at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix. A 35-year-old woman named Pam Reynolds has a swollen blood vessel in her brain that could rupture at any second. To save her life, doctors have to perform an operation so risky, it requires them to intentionally stop her heart. Surgeons intentionally flatlined Pam's heart monitor to reach the deep-seated aneurysm. They dropped her body temperature to 60 degrees and drained the blood entirely from her head. To measure brainstem activity, they taped her eyes shut and plugged her ears with tiny speakers blasting 100 decibel clicks. By every medical metric available, Pam Reynolds was dead. Looking at this heavily staffed operating room, you can see how impossible it would be for a clinically dead patient to know what was happening. Yet when Pam woke up, she accurately described the exact sequence of the surgery. She even repeated the specific, private conversations the surgical team had while her brain was entirely shut down. She identified this exact surgical bone saw, noting that its distinct shape looked just like an electric toothbrush. She also knew that the doctors had to shock her heart twice to revive her, a detail so hyper-specific that even the lead surgeon didn't immediately recall it. Pam's eyes were taped, her ears were plugged, her brain was devoid of blood. So how did she observe her own surgery? Does this mean human consciousness can actually detach from the physical body? Or is there a biological mechanism that explains what we see at the edge of death? Look at this vintage brass scale. In 1901, Dr. Duncan McDougall used a similar device in a morbid experiment. He placed terminally ill patients on a giant, specialized cot, attempting to weigh them at the exact moment of death. He recorded a sudden drop of 21 grams, claiming he had successfully measured the physical weight of the human soul. McDougall's methods were highly flawed, but the core question persisted. By 1975, medical technology had advanced enough to regularly pull patients back from clinical death. These survivors returned with remarkably similar stories, prompting researchers to coin a new medical term, the near-death experience, or NDE. Across thousands of interviews, a clear pattern emerged. Patients described moving rapidly through a dark tunnel before encountering a brilliant beam of light. They felt an overwhelming sense of peace, floated above their physical bodies, and often watched their entire lives flash before their eyes. The underlying structure of the experience is universal, but the specific characters change based on who is having it. Western patients frequently report being greeted by deceased relatives or religious figures. Meanwhile, cases documented in India feature patients encountering Yamraj, the Hindu god of death, and being sent back to the living due to a bureaucratic error in a cosmic ledger. People across different continents and belief systems are experiencing the exact same physiological script. This high level of consistency suggests we aren't looking at snapshots of a supernatural realm. We are looking at a shared biological failure occurring inside the human brain. This diagram illustrates what psychologists call the dying brain hypothesis. When the heart stops, oxygen levels plummet. The brain's visual cortex is highly sensitive to this drop. The cells around the outer edges of our vision lack the density to survive the oxygen deprivation, so they shut down first, turning completely dark. Because the center of the visual cortex has a much higher density of cells, it remains active longer. As the peripheral vision goes black and the center stays bright, the dying brain perceives a powerful optical illusion, a dark tunnel with a bright light at the end. At the same time, the extreme physical trauma triggers a massive release of endorphins to combat the stress. These chemicals flood the temporal lobe and limbic system, the areas responsible for memory and emotion, causing intense euphoria and triggering rapid, random flashes of past memories.
To understand the sensation of floating outside the body, we can look at this U.S. Navy human centrifuge. In the 1990s, researchers placed fighter pilots in this machine and spun them at high speeds to study the effects of extreme gravitational pull. The rapid rotation forced all the blood out of the pilots' heads, inducing a state called G-lock, or G-force-induced loss of consciousness. When the pilots woke up, they reported traveling through dark tunnels, seeing bright lights, and hovering above their own bodies. None of them were dying. They simply lacked oxygen. These spinning chairs demonstrate that the most iconic visual and spatial hallmarks of an afterlife, the tunnel, the light, and the detachment, can be triggered without a single heartbeat stopping. A temporary drop in brain blood pressure creates the very sensations we once assumed required a soul. But to completely rule out the existence of the soul, scientists needed to test if consciousness actually detaches from the physical form. This led to the AWARE study, one of the most comprehensive investigations into out-of-body experiences ever conducted. This room layout shows their methodology. Researchers placed high shelves in hospital wards where cardiac arrests were common. On top of each shelf, they placed a specific image facing upward. The only way to see this hidden picture was to be literally floating near the ceiling, looking down. Over 4 years, across 15 different hospitals, scientists monitored thousands of cardiac arrest patients. Several patients survived and reported the sensation of floating above their beds. Yet, when interviewed, not a single one could identify the hidden images on the shelves. The sensation of hovering above the operating table is a genuine biological hallucination triggered by trauma. But the total lack of verifiable visual data suggests that human consciousness remains locked firmly inside the skull. Science can neatly explain the tunnel, the light, and the feelings of peace, but this brings us right back to the case of Pam Reynolds. Her experience resists every biological explanation we currently have. Skeptics suggest she briefly regained consciousness during the surgery, but even if she did, her brain was devoid of blood, and her ears were blocked by speakers emitting 100 decibel clicks, the equivalent of standing next to a roaring subway train. Hearing a quiet conversation between surgeons under those conditions defies the basic laws of biology. Look at Dr. Robert Spetzler, the neurosurgeon who performed the operation. Even years later, he admitted he has absolutely no scientific explanation for how his clinically dead patient knew the exact shape of a concealed bone saw, or that her heart required 2 specific electric shocks to restart. The Pam Reynolds case remains a persistent crack in the scientific wall. It is a documented medical anomaly that staunch skeptics cannot fully dismiss, and afterlife believers cannot definitively prove. In science, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A few unexplained medical anomalies do not provide a solid enough foundation to safely assume a second life is waiting for us. So if we can't count on a second act, we have to look closely at how we handle the first. When palliative care nurses interview patients in their final days, they ask them to reflect on their deepest regrets. The most common answer they hear has nothing to do with a lack of faith or fear of final judgment. The overwhelming regret dying people share is that they didn't live a life true to themselves, choosing instead to meet the expectations of others. What happens after our monitors flatline is a mystery every single one of us will eventually solve for ourselves. Until that moment arrives, our most logical step is to treat this life and this planet as the only paradise we know for sure exists.